Knuckles' anniversary comic. It starts by reminding me what Angel Island is. Oh my god, I know. Penders did the same thing where he had a bunch of narration about this before the start of the Knuckles Chaotic special. Knuckles' whole ego rests on thinking he's great at his job after all the times he's failed at it. That's sad. I wish he could get a hobby. Why are there so many pages of worthless recap? Everyone who's read this issue knows Knuckles already. You'd have to be shown this by someone else without ever delving into the Sonic series to find any of this not boring. And then this page would just make you wish the story was about stuff like this instead of being about nothing right now. He's just standing in front of the Emerald as usual and reflecting on his life. How is he not really bored? I'd rather see what he thinks about when not thinking about all this, which he usually wouldn't because he knows this stuff. It was only modern Knuckles starting with Generations who was comically arrogant. You could argue that he was like that originally because it makes no sense for him to just suddenly become arrogant out of nowhere, and he was just hiding it better earlier. The point is he's annoying me. I guess the logic is he's pretending to be arrogant out of shame for getting tricked by Eggman so many times. Just because you can come up with an explanation for it doesn't make it good. Like Tails cowering in front of Chaos Zero. And again, this is the same thing Penders did. When he first introduced Knuckles and Archie, he had him be confident in himself. But this isn't even in a cool way that reflects that he was seen as cool when he first showed up. It's blatantly just at his expense, where he goes on to think that he can be humble about how great he is, so the point is that he's delusional. He looks down and notices the islands that Sonic Superstars took place on. So because he just noticed this, despite it being in front of him, I have to assume that they just came to view because Angel Island's always moving ahead relative to the rest of the world. Even though in SA1 the island fell straight down when it fell, and why would it have been told to stop moving ahead when the Master Emerald shattered? It fell because it lost the battery that gave it all of its magical power. Inertia would have had it keep going ahead. It wouldn't have gotten a chance to cast another spell that would cause it to stop moving ahead. This comic's so engaging I'd rather talk about other continuities. When you waste a bunch of pages on nothing happening and recap, it gives away that there's not enough story to last an issue. I guess they called Knuckles on his cell phone to tell him to bail them out of trouble, because they're not telepathic. I was always unimpressed by Trip from her weird helmet to her being a guardian of an island again, so she's just a lazy Knuckles ripoff which misses the appeal of a new story and implies that the writer had run out of ideas. Knuckles gets the idea to teach Trip. He asks why he doesn't just do that. That just makes a plot hole. It would have made more sense if this story took place directly after Superstars. He happily abandons the Master Emerald that could be being spied on by a robot for all he knows, and finds Trip. It turns out Flynn exaggerated her personality. She's drawn to look like she needs toughening up, even though she did in her original game. When even Pontac and Graf read wiki pages before writing, and he could have just done that to learn about her like I did. He relates to Trip, and she reveals immediately that other members of her species are still around. Nothing in her wiki page contradicts this. And while you don't see them in the level that's her city in the game, you almost never see citizens standing in city levels in the game, so by that logic, City Escape and the first level of Sonic Advance 3 are really abandoned cities. We didn't see any of her people going out to celebrate after the giant black dragon was defeated. Obviously none of her people knew about the black dragon, or they were all hiding because that's the smart thing to do. And all the people that were outside were already there. The animation shows you a tiny little percentage of the islands. Someone also showed off a mural that he thought implied that everyone in their civilization died to a cataclysm, but that doesn't prove that the vast majority died, leaving only her family, and it was extremely vague anyways. It doesn't prove that nobody in her family is still around anymore. Some people had to have survived, or she wouldn't exist. So Game Purists accused us of being like Penders with the Echidnas because they made a wrong assumption about Trip based on the fact that she's like Knuckles. and cling to the assumption on the flimsiest of evidence because they didn't like seeing other members of the species of a character they could play as again. Apparently Amy's just fine, being another hedgehog. I didn't find any irrefutable evidence that she's actually the last of her kind. If her character bio said that, they would have been using that as evidence. If the manual said that, they would have been using that as evidence. If she is the last of her kind, blame Sega for not being clear. And if they weren't clear at this point in the franchise, it's because they don't care. Why would they not put that in the manual when they put in the manual Sonic 3 for Knuckles? Just because she's a Knuckles clone doesn't necessarily mean she's the last of her kind, or should be. It would be needlessly depressing for her to have to raise herself with no one to take care of her if she gets hurt or sick. I never liked that about Knuckles either. The best I can do is assume that the Master Emerald raised him. Now, if Sega officially confirms this is false in a character file or something, well, this is still a separate continuity that contradicted the games over 100 times. So the only problem there is the comic isn't honest about it not being the same continuity, which makes people expect the IDW characterizations in the games. Personally, I never thought Trip was the last of her kind in the first place. Assuming that would make just as much sense as assuming Rouge is the last of her kind. Like, none of the other new characters are the last of their kind. Aside from a few of the villagers being fat, this is a very lazy way of designing these characters. None of them have their color schemes inverted compared to Trip's, where the dark brown part is in a different part and so on. Even the echidnas had some of them be purple or brown. There's no way they would all share a hairstyle either. It's just as realistic and believable that a last of his kind character like Knuckles would have at least a few other members of his species around, because otherwise, where did he come from? The games never explain what happened to Knuckles' parents and the other families that provided the genetic diversity for him to even exist in the first place. This is just more likely. She's Knuckles if she wasn't doomed to die if she got hurt or sick. Trip says when Eggman showed up, she snuck away and warned everyone to hide. This was accused of not being consistent with some other comic that was promoting this. But first off, there's no proof Trip didn't find out about Eggman's arrival before she met Bang. Why does anyone talk like that comic is canon and not this anyways? Also, she doesn't need to explain this to make it consistent with the game. Again, almost no city level that's dwelled in has people visible in it when you play the level. She angsts about getting bullied into helping the bad guys. You'd think a comic full of recap pages would have shown what she even means. She always had a spear with her, so the only reason she got bullied into anything was that she lacked the guts to attack them with a spear the instant their backs were turned like anybody could easily. I guess she didn't have faith in herself to outrun him? If the people around her were smart, they would have given her a non-sharp weapon so she wouldn't feel like simply hurting them with it was crossing a line. I always thought she was stupid for working for Eggman when she should have known he was evil. Turns out she was stupid. She'd rather put her own ego and feelings over doing what's right for the entire world. So she's neutral when she'd like to say she's a hero. And her grandpa looks like a lame version of Tikala's father, but overly short and fat. At first he seems sweet, but it turns out he's just lecturing her because she's not acting like a stereotypical guardian. And he lectures her to follow tradition like Knuckles' father would. And he says she'll grow into the ceremonial armor. That just brings up the plot hole of why the hell didn't she get given armor that would actually fit her if she lived around a bunch of people who should know to make this stuff? Why would she have to wear the ceremonial armor when she's not even old enough for it? Why wouldn't they have made ceremonial armor just as back then as the original ceremonial armor? That's a different size so it could fit her. So why couldn't there just be multiple different sizes of ceremonial armor that were passed down from generation to generation? If she was the last of her kind, well, it would still be forced, since her parents should have had ceremonial armor from childhood lying around to pass down to her. And she had years to search the entire island so she could find them. Why would that ceremonial armor get lost? Which I assume is the excuse in the games. if she is the last of her kind. And why would she have to be a guardian when she's still a little kid if the other people like her are still living nearby? So it'd be common sense to have a big, strong adult be the acting guardian while she's a kid. Real monarchies didn't literally have kids be the leaders if they lost their parents early. I guess it is bad that she's not the last of her kind, because why is she even a guardian in the first place if she's this young? Why is she the only one guarding it? Knuckles is asked what his armor's like, and is reluctant to admit he doesn't have any. I get it, Sega, she's better Knuckles. And is she really? She has a spear to rely on instead of giant fists that have super strength. But because it's a kid's series, she's never going to use it anyways. The fact that she has a helmet decreases the tension with her. And the way she was before character development makes her prone to being portrayed like she's a wimp just because she's not like Blaze. Also, if she runs into people, she'd hurt them with the spikes on her head. But since it's for kids, that's only a problem in theory. Like her useless spear. It's no better than Antoine's sword. It's sweet to see her show so much respect and faith in Knuckles. But the way Knuckles is portrayed as nervous and insecure here already makes it clear that the comics got no respect for him and would rather punch down at someone who hasn't been written properly since I was a kid. He was so obsessed with punching things in Frontier, so he was still LEGO Dimensions Knuckles. Why does he already have no faith in himself to be able to improve her when nothing is seen as proven that she's got a different personality now? When her personality is why he didn't have faith in her. This would have only made sense if this was accurately portrayed Trip. He must have had abusive parents that have been given the name Trip. But heaven forbid Knuckles think that in the thought bubble at any point. That'd be self-aware. That would be the writer caring enough about the game to think about it and comment on it. At least in a shallow surface level anyways. It's not like Pontaff cared about the games because they commented on them. And the writer didn't even see the whole game since she trips without her helmet on. I suppose it was justified in universe because she tripped because she was looking back at Knuckles. But that was a stupid thing of her to do. You don't have to look at someone just because you're talking to him. By making her clumsy even without the helmet on, he completely missed the point of her story. She was clumsy before for a good reason, and now she's clumsy because she's got no common sense. I'm so tired of that trait. Oh, her name's Trip, so she's only about being clumsy. Obviously. I always thought of her name as her name first, and besides, Trip can also mean taking a trip to a place. So I think that's what I actually thought of. Just because Knuckles' name is Knuckles doesn't mean he's literally all about thinking about punching stuff with his knuckles. Can you imagine how one-dimensional it'd be if he was written like that? The brilliance of the Sonic characters is that their personalities don't entirely match up with what cliché you think they'd be associated with. Sonic's fast, but he's not always hyperactive. Amy ended up becoming a subversion because now she isn't avoided by him and just treats him like a friend most of the time. Even though her name's based on the word to love in French. And you'd also expect Tails to be an insufferable genius because he's a genius. You'd also expect Rouge to be a flirt, but that never factored into his story in the games. Even Silver isn't Silver, so Flint should have known that the same rule applied to Trip. If you have a Sonic character called Trip, that means she either doesn't trip or is barely ever clumsy. She also never takes trips, aside from the special circumstance that was her game. Knuckles has a lot of dialogue, and it's really boring me. This should have just been shown to us by his actions with the art. He could be standing on a rock while saying you should know the terrain, which was his advantage in his first game. She says she already qualifies for all of that, and he wants her to prove it. So he chases her and destroys some pile of rocks by running past it with his fists held in front of him. Eventually Trip catches up to him easily and asks for lunch that he doesn't have on him. So he gets mad at her despite what a long run they had and says he's gonna build up her endurance, not feeling empathy for her out of jealousy. Am I supposed to not like this character anymore? He says they're gonna fight despite him having spiked gloves. So naturally being faced with spikes would make her put on a helmet. Otherwise she'd get hospitalized. I'm just forced to assume the reason he thinks he won't injure or kill her is he assumes she's got rings to protect her. He should have told her that to reassure her, but apparently he's just a jerk. What made him think punching her helmet was a good idea? Sure, he has super strength, but that's no reason to punch her family heirloom instead of the weaker rest of her body. And speaking of super strength, yeah, that heirloom must have been made of the best materials in the world to not even be slightly damaged by him. Why would he risk destroying her family heirloom by hitting it? Like that wouldn't have any sort of consequences? He didn't talk like he was planning to take it easy on her either. His punch caused her to fall on him and hurt his foot. It's an interesting looking way of getting her to hurt him at least, but if she could be allowed to throw some punches and kicks accurately, that'd be great, instead of disrespecting both of them. I get the feeling that I'm supposed to like seeing Knuckles get hurt because he was being annoying in this issue. But I was just thinking that it's not his fault he's being ridden badly out of obvious spite. And how am I supposed to get any catharsis out of Slapstick that's got the impact censored by a flash of light? He at least turns her helmet the right way for her, though that has to be for the sake of wanting a fair fight to prove himself against, and not out of compassion, since he's not a good babysitter. He compounds his embarrassment by somehow deciding to say round 2 based on himself getting hurt once. And she decides to wimp out and run away crying because he's being mean. If she was like this in the game, she wouldn't have been able to finish her personal story campaign. It's not like they've been best friends for years and all of a sudden he's being mean to her. So it should have been obvious to everybody this is out of character, and thus completely missing the point of the character being used again. Like most of IDW, this only looks fine in a vacuum if anything, but this is supposed to take place where the game sets its past, not a phantom version of the games. So it's a continuity error contradicting them. This version of Trip never would have stood up to Fang. I expected Knuckles to be sad and upset with himself because he made her cry. Instead, he's just angry at her. He remembers Amy saying that all he did was break stuff and yell when he decided his friends would go camping with them. The only reason he'd break stuff would be that they brought modern camping equipment, which from the perspective of someone who lives outside, would destroy the point of roughing it out in the woods to see what it used to be like living outside. But in the next panel, their tent's still intact. So what did he break? This is completely out of character. Knuckles only gets mad when his Master Emerald or Ego is threatened, and the latter would only be if Sonic was the one mistreating him in the first place. Otherwise, he doesn't just get mad for literally no reason. It's sad when Boom Knuckles looks like a better friend and character than him. Him saying dumb stuff would still be better than his friends hating him. Tails is so cheap that he would rather go through the trouble of making a tent himself so he could put his insignia on it than have Sonic buy a tent. It's not like it's a high-tech tent. What's the point? You'd think it all the time of him living outside, he would have seen what lightning can do to things by now. How did this interpretation of Knuckles have the ability to realize he comes on too strong sometimes? He only would have heard that phrase when it was being used in response to Amy. How did he use that phrase wrong? He remembers Tails being grateful that Knuckles guarded the outside of his tent all night during a storm. And somehow he isn't sneezing. And he was nice to Tails because he didn't give up on camping. So Tails thanks him. This would have made a better story, but not by much. Because it would have just been a story about vilifying Knuckles. He also has to tell Amy to put her whole body into a swing or the hammer won't work as well. Why does Knuckles have to tell Amy how to use a hammer? I don't think he even respects Amy. This was common sense for her to figure out on her own. She would have figured it out after the first time. He thinks he has to focus on the positives and be uplifting and kind. And then he thinks about Sonic, who the artist still draws as an unlikable bully despite the writer just describing him accurately for change. So because Sonic smirks at him outside of all the games, where he literally never treats him like that ever, he gets mad. I bet he is gonna do Sonic's way though, and somehow delude himself that he's doing things his way. He goes up to Trip, who somehow cowers in front of him. And there's a nice moment where these ridiculous looking animals straight from the games are protective of her. And then he pushes them aside effortlessly without being intimidated because he has super strength, and they conveniently leave him alone after that. He says he's sorry. He says he had no one to train him, so he has no idea how to be a good teacher. I'm expected to not be bored by him reminding me of stuff I already know about him. Get a move on. Knuckles says that Trip's even better than him by having giant animals. And it's kind of a comedic moment because the animals are offended. It would have been funnier though if the art actually tried to make them look offended. Finally, she gets impressed when he starts telling her about his island, and she eventually starts gushing over him. He says she's smart just because she flattered him, stating the obvious. What kind of anniversary comic is this where there doesn't look like there's any appeal in the character it's based on? Trip decides to show Knuckles what she has to guard, but again, it doesn't just cut to the part where she shows him it. How is it that there's any animals still trapped in Robot to this point, when this is a place she's supposed to be guarding every day? She shows him a mural and expects me to believe that the whole history was lost to time, and then immediately contradicts herself. I think she's saying, this is the only thing that remains of history. The whole history was lost to time, rather than the whole history was lost to time. If any of the history was being preserved, why did any of it get lost when her people are still around? She says her ancestors used the Chaos Emeralds to do incredible things. So it's not just Tails and Shadow who can use individual emeralds to do magic. Her people are magical too. The story goes on to bore me again with more recap. And Knuckles compliments her. I always hate when the art gets overly anime like this. And at times like this, I can't even overlook it. The comic got me used to stupid, exaggerated character expressions, but sometimes I can't ignore it. When you have the art make a habit of depicting stuff that can't actually be happening, it makes it a lot harder to convey what is happening and get everyone to understand. Sometimes you're going to see fire. It's going to be harder to actually convey that there's fire around, because it could just be anime fire. Every time a character's mouth is this toothless, huge anime mouth, it looks awful. But I usually don't comment on art because it's stating the obvious. I also get to see her hug him and he pets her. But sadly, being treated like that embarrasses him into deciding to leave her. He somehow wonders how he's supposed to get back to Angel Island after all of the times he would have gone back there after the events of the games. The same spiteful joke all over again. You'd think he would have been corrected on this by now. He knows what his critics are saying about him. He's complained about it on his podcast. And yet he keeps making the same mistakes. Why is Chip acting clumsy again? This time it's for literally no reason. She tells him that there's still a lot of Eggman stuff left around the island, and maybe one of his flying pods is still working. Why don't you say maybe? Why won't all of Eggman's stuff be gathered by the people living here by now to be taken advantage of after all of this time? They should be using the flying pods on a daily basis. He's nice to her again, and she's treated like his fangirl. And the writer has to get in another dig at Knuckles, showing that even Knuckles doesn't think he's smart. Like in Sonic 3, it's so convenient that the flying controls for the Eggmobiles are so user-friendly that anybody can learn to fly them with no teacher. It would have been a little interesting to get shown what the controls looked like, but nobody cared. That required the artist to care so much about a game concept that he'd think about it, when the writers have shown consistent preference for the stuff that they came up with. I assume it works with a regular steering wheel, gas and brake pedals, and then 2 buttons for up and down. So I guess it's not a plot hole that he can fly this thing. But there has to be a reason that most aircraft isn't something that literally anybody can use. But I think it's because aircraft is a lot bigger than this thing. The story ends with him bragging about himself in his head. Why do you think he's an excellent judge of character after all, when he just admitted he was wrong about thinking she needed his help? Which is debatable with how she's being portrayed. If he wanted to help her, why doesn't he give her some spiked mitts? The story gives you the impression that she's guarding something that's on the same level as his emerald, which would validate him taking it so seriously. But actually she's guarding something whose only power is to seal away a specific dragon that they have no reason to believe would get free, and only got free once to force the story to happen. It literally says somehow in the story description. So most of the time it's a normal jewel. Nothing terrible would happen if someone stole it. Based on the track record of history, if Superstars is the first time it got free, then chances are someone could steal it, and then literally nothing bad would happen for like thousands of years. And then when it did get free, the dragon would make it obvious anyways, and someone would defeat it anyways. They would still be training the Guardians to be able to attack the dragon and win. The Master Emerald is far more valuable. So it's great that his thoughts make it clear that he'll have her guard his emerald someday. Or else why would he even think of her as the next generation of Guardians? So that explains why he's training her. He could have just gotten somebody else. But the story is so pointless because he doesn't do anything valuable training her. It'd be common sense to at least teach her to instinctively spin dash as an attack and not bother with the spear, which you'd think she would have learned from the game, but apparently not. Or at least give her a weapon that isn't sharp so she'd feel like using it against people. That's another thing. If it turns out she can spin dash in the game, she had literally no excuse for working for Fang then, because the whole time she could have spin dashed at him and Eggman as many times as she wanted while they'd be helpless on the ground, and she could spin dash away from them too fast for them to catch up with her, which they shouldn't be able to anyways, because again, she could just keep spin dashing into them. But Knuckles doesn't even tell her this vital advice he knows she needs to hear. He never gets to see her face off with someone trying to steal her onks and prove that she's not only willing to spin dash at him, but doesn't need help to fend him off. This boring issue by Ian Flynn just came off like it was used to vent about how Knuckles is from the games now, when that's just preaching to the choir, and make Trip look better than him when the writer of the story doesn't respect and understand her anyways. He thinks Trip is still clumsy without her helmet and never stopped being a wimp. It's like he doesn't like writing shy, introverted girls. They all have to be butt-kick female characters, apparently. I had to do research on the characters so I could fully criticize the story, but he didn't even bother to do that much effort. And if I hadn't looked up the character and what the comic's biggest haters were saying about this, just in case I missed anything, I would have come out of this with an even worse impression of Trip than before. It's nice to see her and Knuckles be nice to each other, but it's nice in a bittersweet way because writing Knuckles as a flanderized, punching-obsessed, arrogant fool makes her look stupid for fangirling over him. So it'd only be deserved if it was good Knuckles. But he hasn't been around for 20 years. Why wouldn't he just write Knuckles like he did in Archie again? He didn't come off like he hated him every time he wrote his character there. He's choosing to write him as an unlikable idiot as soon as IDW comes around, because that's his idea of what Game Knuckles is. The only explanation for this is that he didn't care about Superstar's story because he didn't come up with it. Like Penner's not caring about the canon other writers established. I get hating Knuckles as he is now, but that doesn't make it right to write him like that, just to mock that version of the character. It'd be better to make a story that's as enjoyable as possible. Not write him exactly how he was in Lost World under Pontac and Graf, but he gets away with it because he makes references. Sega didn't fire him for using shadow androids to kill Whisper's friends, even though they weren't happy about that, according to his podcast.
Killed those Diamond Cutters members.
Maybe the Diamond Cutters managed to take them all out before they fell. Maybe some still around. Most of them should be gone as of Sonic Heroes and Giant Hedgehog, but Sega wasn't super wild about us using them.
So he wouldn't think they'd fire him for writing SE2 style Knuckles. He was hired to pander to his fanbase who like everything he writes. And even when they don't, they just blame Sega for it without doing any research. So I'm pretty sure he has perfect job security. Usually a bad story is just sad, but a popular bad story is enraging. It's the opposite of protecting the brand to defend bad writing. It's ensuring that it never gets written as well as it deserves because the fans like it. I think even the fans complained about Amy being Sally, because otherwise why would Amy have quit being the leader of the restoration? So it can respond to fan backlash and improve as a result, which could save the comic from being cancelled. The story's about Knuckles being too hard on Trip trying to toughen her up, but not learning the lesson that she doesn't need toughening up and instead respect her because she got lucky and fell on him and butters him up. It's no wonder it was more about people other than Knuckles if the only story Flynn thinks he can write a game like Knuckles to have by himself involve him just standing in front of the masked ceramic and remembering his life. Which is what I joked about when I wondered how he could have an entire comic. This time he apparently needs to run off to hang out with a new character who is mostly shilled as a better version of him just so he could have a story. At least that's believable compared to him treasure hunting for no reason. Of course he'd want to train someone to be a good guardian when he doesn't have an heir. But even that didn't impress me much, because the Knuckles show already had him do that.